Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm with the Center for Transportation. I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest webinar in our webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about contracting for mobility, a case study in the Los Angeles and Puget Sound regions. This is based on a paper that we released last week. We're going to be detailing the results and the recommendations in that paper, but this is part of a larger program that ENO is involved in. In 2016, the Federal Transit Administration announced 11 different projects across the country to receive funding for their Mobility on Demand Sandbox program. And one of those projects is a first mile, last mile mobility on demand pilot in the Puget Sound and Los Angeles regions. And we, ENO, was part of a research team on that project consisting of the University of Washington, UCLA, and University of Oregon, where we are conducting both a data analysis and a policy analysis of that project, evaluating how different aspects have gone and what are some of the lessons that other agencies around the country can learn. So this is the first in a series of papers where we're looking at certain aspects of the program design, data sharing, contracting, fare integration, and a few other topics. This one obviously focused on contracting, trying to get some lessons on as to how agencies can create effective contracts with the private sector for mobility on demand projects, and what agencies and the private sector should expect in terms of the process it takes to get from an initial agreement to a contract that is enforceable and in execution. It's been a long process, and we've been involved in every step, and we've learned quite a bit from it. So we wrote that up in the paper that we're going to present today. And so with that, I'm going to hand over the webinar to the lead author, Alice Grossman, also with ENO, who's going to walk us through some of the lessons learned and some of the things that we recommend. Alice, please.
Great. Thank you, Paul. So Paul gave a good overview of the Federal Mobility on Demand Sandbox program. So we're just going to go through a little bit of some general elements of mobility on demand partnerships and collaborations with transit agencies, and focus specifically on this project with LA Metro, King County Metro, and Sound Transit that ENO was directly involved in and continues to remain directly involved in. So this project was originally awarded to the LA Metro in conjunction with Sound Transit, King County Metro, and a mobility on demand partner, which actually ended up switching partway through the partnership, as well as ENO and the additional research universities. And so some of the reasons why we want to go through this is to be able to provide best practices for other transit agencies, regardless of whether or not mobility on demand partnerships is the right way to move forward for specific transit agencies. Being able to do these pilots that are enabled by programs like the FTA Sandbox project allows agencies to figure out what kinds of service works well for them and what they can get out of it. So starting with a pilot project is a good way to move forward with that, and figuring out what the goals are for that pilot project is really necessary to get anything out of this experiment to see, how should we be moving forward? Is this helping us achieve the goals as an agency that we want to achieve? And if so, in what ways? How can we develop future service to better reach those goals? So I did want to start out also by just going over the specific project goals for the Los Angeles and Puget Sound project, which was really looking at defining how these different mobility on demand services can align with existing transit service, to figure out how we can get better first mile, last mile solutions. So really getting people to and from the trains and buses was the goal here. And they specifically also wanted to look at different equal access for individuals with disabilities, individuals with lower household incomes, minority populations. So this wasn't just a sort of overall across the board effort. It was very specifically targeted populations from an access to transit perspective for this specific project. And they were also looking at specifically how to do different types of payment integration between transit operators and the mobility on-demand platforms. And this element, along with a lot of the other ones, is particularly interesting because we had 3 transit agencies at the center of this project, 2 different regions. And so we were really able to look at this from a little bit more of a holistic perspective than if it was just sort of one specific example moving in one direction. So I think one of the interesting things about this project is being able to do that comparison across agencies and comparison across regions, and that's going to come up a couple more times. So some of the other reasons why we're doing this, why we're trying to share the lessons learned is, as I said, developing these goals at the beginning is really important. That's something that's got to go into the contracting process from the very beginning to be able to move forward with it. So if the foundation of your pilot project or your program is to get specific outcomes, figuring out how to write that in from the very beginning to make sure that the transit agency, the mobility on demand partner, and whoever else is involved in the project are all working towards the same goals, or at least know what goals every partner is working towards, is a really important element of this. So being able to write that directly into the contract and have that sort of established from the beginning, we found to be a very important part of moving forward. And that really shaped the rest of the way the contracting process came together and all whether or not this project is reaching the goals that it should be, and how to move forward with it after that. So we have to take into account all of these different policies behind the project as well. This was particularly interesting, again, because we're working in 2 different regions. So there's obviously the federal regulations and federal laws that, such as the Americans with Disability Act, different civil rights laws and regulations. So those are really going to shape how a lot of these projects move forward. But then you also have to be looking at very specific sort of state and regional policies. So labor laws in different regions might be very different. Data sharing regulations and restrictions and different sunshine laws and Privacy Act laws in different states is going to be widely different. So being able to figure out in that very specific context also how to build these contracts and those partnerships, it's going to differ. And we even saw that between the state of Washington and the state of California. And then also even just at an agency level. So specifically, in this case, looking at procurement rules. Every agency is going to have different procurement rules. Agencies might also have different labor laws. All of these you've got to look at every level. And so that makes it specifically complicated to draw these up. But there's a lot that you can learn from looking at different examples and best practices across the country. So specifically looking down at the agency that we have here in Los Angeles, and Puget Sound, as Paul mentioned at the beginning, this has been a lengthy process, and we've been involved throughout. So the proposal was awarded from the FTA in October of 2016, and ENO was part of that proposal with a couple of research institutions, as were King County Metro, Sound Transit, and LA Metro. They were originally partnering with LIST for this, a lot of project planning into that. There was staff time, there was project development time, but as it turned out, while they were going through this planning phase, it turns out that the goals of the agencies and the goals of the mobility on demand provider in this specific case varied so much that moving forward into the contracting process ended up not being feasible in this case. So what the agencies had to do was sort of go back and think about, okay, that partnership isn't going to work. What do we need to do to move forward? And so LA Metro took the lead, and this is actually another example too of where this federal context makes a big difference. So because this was a mobility on demand sandbox project, there were specific regulations that applied as a transit innovation project that might not apply if it's funded by sources. And LA Metro as an agency, then down looking at the agency-specific policies, also has a certain amount of flexibility with their pilot projects. So they were able to go out and solicit some proposals from different mobility on-demand providers. They ended up choosing VIA as the one that was going to be the best match moving forward. But unfortunately, because we were in this 2-region case, the Seattle area, Puget Sound area transit agencies didn't have the same setup. So this original partnership where Sound Transit was going to take the lead with Lyft, Sound Transit had very specific procurement policies, and so once they went into switching the mobility on demand provider, that got complicated in the region. This meant that the contracting process had to switch from again, this is a very regionally and transit agencies, so able to sort of work together to change that contracting process fairly seamlessly, which was very helpful for the project moving forward. After the agencies switched to mobility on demand provider, they still had to work through all of those planning and contracting provisions. So this timeline extended basically by the end of this summer. We ended up with signed agreements in all agents, also a number of the other actors in this project. So the contract wasn't only between the transit agencies and the mobility on demand providers, but there were a lot of additional actors. So you can see also the Seattle Department of Transportation ended up providing some funding for this project. They were trying to increase service in certain areas, and so there was a contractual relationship developed there. We also had the research team brought on with the Center for Transportation, the University of Oregon, University of Washington. So there was a process there in development as well. And then also VIA had to do their own procurement with the vehicles and with their individual drivers. They use contracted drivers. So there was a lot of moving parts, and the number of different organizations involved in this made for a rather timely process, but a very productive outcome in the end. So once we dive into the actual contracts in this case study in both Los Angeles and the Puget Sound region, there are a couple of different focus points that we can look at. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything in this webinar. So very specifically, if you go back into, as I mentioned, different agencies have different procurement regulations, for example. So in this case, the procurement ended up falling to VIA, especially so that they would have to be able to get those wheelchair accessible vehicles and really follow the service that the transit agencies were desiring to provide, and that goes back to those project goals. But they let VIA do the procurement there, and also VIA was in charge of contracting out their drivers. So to a certain extent, at that point, the agencies really handed it over to the mobility on demand provider, but the contract had to stipulate what they were looking for so that they were able to trust them to move forward with all of these elements while still, standing by the labor provisions and the accessibility desires that those agencies wanted. The labor element is also particularly interesting, especially moving forward, and this is something that is going to make sure to stay on top of as it evolves. But it was important to VIA to maintain their independent contractor drivers. Many of the transportation companies that provide mobility on demand services utilize independent contractor drivers, but an interesting policy change that we've seen recently is that as of January of 2020, in the state of California, AB 5 has just passed, and that means that a lot of these drivers are very likely to be reclassified as employees and can no longer function as independent contract drivers, especially if they're on very specific schedules, et cetera, for this kind of pilot project. So looking at how that kind of thing has to change, given changes in state policies, is going to be another interesting element of this project as that unfolds moving forward. Probably one of the most contentious elements of the contract that took quite a bit of back and forth and conversations between the different actors was the issues of liabilities, and that was sort of looking at indemnities, the limitation of liability, looking at the insurance, and there were a lot of conversations, and this ended up really being kind of a give and take between the mobility on demand provider and the transit agencies, one of you has to take on a certain amount of liability if somebody else is able to maybe cover a little bit more insurance or indemnification. And so figuring out exactly what that right balance was something that took a while, but in the end it was worthwhile talking it out, and both or all of the actors involved were able to come to a solution that they felt comfortable with, and they were able to move forward with that. Another interesting aspect of these contracts was looking at sort of payment and risk sharing and how the agencies were able to tie that together. As I mentioned, although this is one project and we're trying to look at regional comparisons, a lot of this is going to be different just depending on the agency and the local and state context that we're in. So the payment structure in the Los Angeles region and the Puget Sound region is actually pretty different. The difference here is that LA Metro tied the ridership really as a sort of way of risk sharing with VIA as a mobility on demand provider. So both of these agencies have indicators, and we're going to get shortly. And one of those, which is rider driver hour, efficiency of this service if you're looking for driver hour. And so LA Metro didn't necessarily benefits or disincentives. Specifically, they did tie the ridership. If VIA was able to meet the 2.5 riders per driver hour, then they were going to even with the payments from LA Metro. In the Seattle region, they did not tie it in the same way. But one of the other major differences here is that the fare integration piece functioned completely differently in the two regions. So while in Los Angeles, there is currently not a fare integration with the tap card, so all of those fares are going from the riders to VIA, which sort of enables the structure that they set up. In the Puget Sound region, that's a different setup. So the riders are able to pay with their Orca card, which they can also use on Sound Transit and on King County Metro. And that allows for this seamless fare integration. But when they get into the VIA, those fares are going to the transit agencies through the Orca setup, which means that for riders who are not using Orca cards, and remember, one of the goals of this project was to try and enable more services and more access to transit for people who might be unbanked or people who don't necessarily have their transit card. So enabling other forms of payment was very important in this project. And so those payments are going towards VIA, and then those are being taken out of the monthly invoices coming from the transit agencies. So there's a lot of way to set up these payment structures, and it works differently for every agency in terms of what's going to work best. But in both of these cases, the agencies thought really creatively, and they were able to reach all the goals that they wanted to through various payment structures that, while they seem fairly complicated, they really are able to get at those underlying goals, which helped us set up the project from the beginning. So another major element of this contract was the attachments. And so part of working through the contractual element was a lot of conversation around elements such as data sharing and what the deliverables are going to be and what the key performance indicators are going to be. And so basically, in scope of work that really sets up the service provision element of the project was also attached to the contract. And so that went through this process of setting up those goals, going through all of those conversations, and then figuring out how the data sharing can relate to goals and help support the different key performance indicators and make all those links. So being able to sort of write all of those out very specifically and attach that to a contractual agreement can also be very helpful moving forward. It makes everything very clear, and you're able to sort of tie all of those different project elements back to the service and back to the goals of the project. As I said, we were going to go through the different key performance indicators. This was specifically difficult in this case because part of the point of the Mobility on Demand Sandbox is to try new things. And so these were, this is a new type of service in an area that hasn't necessarily done this service before. So figuring out what the targets should be is particularly difficult. This is the experiment. So the contract made sure that it was flexible, that they were going to set these key performance indicators, sort of a guess based on our knowledge as transit mobility on demand professionals. but it was something that we could go back to and evaluate throughout the project as well. And as I said before, also these weren't necessarily tied to very specific incentives or disincentives. It was really just that this is the expectation, and we're all agreeing on that expectation, and we can move forward with the project and figure out how that might need to be adjusted as we move forward with this. So as I noted before, one of the key performance indicators was getting those 2.5 riders per driver hour. But then we were also looking at specifically different elements of customer service, specifically, again, might not have access to smartphones. So come up with a number of lessons learned for this project. We're really focusing on what agencies can learn from these best practices, these examples, sort of do again, don't do again. And so that was looking at sort of this idea, this specific project had, as I mentioned before, a number of organizations involved, and that allowed for, the transit agencies to bring on this team to do an analysis of the equity of the service, to help develop those data sharing agreements to figure out how we can best measure the key performance indicators and tie those back to the goals. And so that's a trade-off. When you've got 7 different agencies, organizations trying to develop contracts, it might take a little longer to get to an agreement, but you've also got a lot of expertise coming into that contract building. So it's a trade-off that you need to think about. Another thing is that a lot of these mobility on demand providers are private companies that haven't been around for a very long time, whereas compared to transit agencies that have been around for a while and they work through the public procurement process. So the timelines that these different organizations are used to are inherently different. So what might seem quick for a transit agency might seem incredibly slow for a mobility on demand provider. And being able to manage those expectations from the beginning and realize that everybody's coming from different perspectives can really help in the negotiation process moving forward. Also, public agencies really need to think about their data needs from the beginning. Specifically, found that working with these agencies with a research team was very helpful. We worked with professors at UCLA, University of Washington, and University of Oregon who have been working with transit and mobility on demand data for many, many years. And to be able to bring in sort of that expert research team was very helpful to figure out what data needed to be collected and how to work that into the contract in the very beginning so that we could really measure the goals and the effectiveness of this program overall. And we did find also that being able to explain that connection makes a big difference to be able to get the data sharing agreements that you want in the end. Another interesting element is sort of really thinking about where these funding sources are coming from. So the Sandbox program has certain regulations, and because this is a pilot project, there's also certain policies that do or don't apply. And that can be advantageous or it can be frustrating. So really thinking about how you're setting up these programs and what the opportunities are going to be, and then also what those challenges might be associated with it from the beginning can help manage expectations. It's also important to have that flexibility, especially when you're looking at pilot programs. I mean, the purpose of pilot programs is trying out something new. So moving forward with a certain amount of flexibility can really benefit the project. In this case, being able to change the mobility on demand provider to set up the service that really was reaching those goals that we wanted to for the purpose of the mobility on demand sandbox was a good opportunity for this project to move forward in the direction that we were hoping it would. So maintaining flexibility around project designs and then also around things like the key performance indicators can be very advantageous as well. I think I have talked more than long enough, so I'm going to let Paul take a look at some of the questions, and we will answer as many as possible.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Alice, for that overview of the paper. I will say I've received a couple messages from folks on the line that we've had some audio issues. and we're actively on this end trying to work to calm that down a little bit, but apologize for the technical difficulties. I think there's a problem with the connection, but we're working on that. In any case, we're now moving to the question and answer portion of the webinar. Anyone can ask it in the control panel, the webinar control panel. There's a question section. Please type your questions. We'll try to get to all of them. We already have a bunch that I'm going to be asking to Alice and answering myself. So please feel free to ask or pose your questions there. Note that the slides and the recording of this webinar will be available online following this, and then also for those that are looking for more specificity, the paper is also available for free download, so please take a look at some of the details there. So with that, we're going to go into some of the questions, and here's one that came in a few minutes ago about the insurance. Alice, can you talk a little bit about the insurance model for the Mobility on Demand project, and whether this was purchased separately or was it extended by the transit agencies? And how did we cover liability, injury, loss? What were some of those specifics that the paper talks about?
Sure. So in this case, the insurance, since VIA was doing the procurement of the vehicles and really running the whole service, the organizations agreed that VIA should be taking on sort of this higher level of insurance and indemnification. But LA Metro was also aware that they were taking on some of this risk at the same time, and so contributed financially to that as well. Got it.
So I wanted to know if you could get a little bit more into the expectations in terms of the outcomes and the cost per boarding, the different things in terms of ridership, and of cost was acceptable to the agencies.
That isn't something that we explored in this paper because we were specifically at the contracting process, the policies behind that. Also, the goal of this project is to get a certain return on investment. It was looking more at the access. And so I'm sure there is a way to do that cost analysis. We haven't done it yet. But we're really trying to focus first on the project goals of increasing access to transit, increasing equity in that access to transit, and that's what the project was built around, was providing this service in very specific areas where the agencies wanted to make sure that people could get to and from the train and the bus, and hopefully be able to give people more mobility options in the Puget Sound and Los Angeles region.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the things that they were very clear at both agencies is that if the goal was to maximize ridership, they probably would not have chosen the service areas that they did. They chose those for very different goals as part of that. And one question that just came up is about the KPIs. One of them was ridership, but there's lots more. Can you talk a little bit about how those are flexible and how frequently those are updated and how that process goes?
Sure. So I think that actually is a testament to the planning and contracting process, that the agencies and VIA were able to put a lot of specifics, again, in that sort of data sharing agreement, and there was good faith that as the project moved forward, we would be able to examine how the service was running and match that up against the goals that, again, were written down and agreed upon at the beginning. And so this is a way that all of the organizations involved from a research, transit, and mobility on demand perspective could really examine what's happening in real time on the ground and see how we need to manage those expectations. Are those goals, the overall goals, being met, and are the KPIs sort of reasonable from a quantitative basis in being able to meet those goals? In terms of how often that they're addressed, I'm not sure that was specified. There are quarterly reports for the agencies, so the data is examined pretty closely on a quarterly basis. The payment structure is a monthly invoice system, so there's also conversations that could happen there at a monthly level, but it was really more of a, as needed readdressing. And then also at the end of the 1-year pilot period, to be able to go back and reevaluate those KPIs from a more holistic perspective as well, to say, okay, this got it underway, and it was really able to grow for a year and see what that potential is. And then you've got some actual on-the-ground data to base any performance indicators moving forward with specific services that the agencies decide might be beneficial.
So we got a couple questions about some specifics on ensuring access, given that was a big focus of this. And this particular question is any attention given to additional costs to women in terms of concerns for personal safety, higher utilization for childcare, family care. How did those considerations go into the access component of this program?
I am actually going to pivot to another paper to answer that question. LA Metro did recently put out a research paper looking at travel behavior and demand for women and girls. And I know you can find that somewhere on their website, and so I would recommend anybody interested in that topic taking a look at that. And they have a whole number of different action plan and recommendations for enabling safer and more comfortable and more affordable transit access and transportation access for women and girls. And then also just, from a more general perspective, a lot of the safety concerns that women note in transportation are things like walking to and from a station in areas that are maybe less well lit or feel less safe, and also the waiting on a platform or at a bus stop, especially at times when there's not a lot of people around. So one of the things that this service does do is provide access for anybody, not just women, who might feel less safe in those certain circumstances, and so it's able to give that sort of more point-to-point access to transit.
Got it. So last question before we wrap it up. What are the differences in the kind of traditional and public agencies and then the new types of agreements with these private companies and public entities regarding the business models and expectations for enhancing transit?
What are the differences?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what the question is getting at is how is this different than a traditional contract that an agency has with a bus operator, for example? And what are some of the new demands that are in place from some of the newer mobility options?
That's a hard question. I might throw it back to you, Paul. I think that this is more of a it really depends on the contract. I think in some ways it's not that different from a lot of other agreements between different transit agencies and different providers. But in this specific case, I think it was more VIA and LA Metro to try to provide a service with agreed upon goals, whereas a lot of those more traditionally contracted out services is really, it's less flexible. I think that gets back to the flexibility to a certain extent. It's a transit agency looking for a service and they're going to pay somebody to provide that service. So it's a different type of process. But Paul, you've done a lot of this sort of contracting research. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we learned from this is that there's an increase in demand for time and timeliness, right? I mean, this is a totally new type of service with new expectations, and both agency staff as well as the private companies are under a lot of pressure to get things done quickly. But anytime that something's new, it does take a long time. And so part of what we talk about and why we focus on process in the paper is to manage the expectation that these things don't happen quickly. And if we were to have pushed it quickly, it probably would not have resulted in a really good outcome. So it's important to take your time. I think the other component here is that we don't know exactly what the service is going to end up looking like. And this is really designed as a pilot, and putting a contract together from a pilot is very different from a kind of run-of-the-mill bus contract that agencies are well-versed in. So I think that those are two areas. but we are at 35 past the hour. So I think, the one thing I will say about this paper and some of the questions that are still coming in, a lot of people are asking about results. What was the ridership? How is this performing? Is it meeting some of the goals? And I'm going to tease the fact that this project is not over. The pilots are still in active operation. They will be concluding in the spring. And as part of the research team, Alice and myself and the rest of the team will be publishing some papers answering the questions of whether these types of pilots make sense, where they make sense, providing some specific guidance on kind of how to use these. This paper was really focused on if you're going to do a pilot, here's how you can structure a contract, and here are some of the lessons that this project learned over the past 3 years in getting this all set up. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today. Again, apologize for the audio issues, but please keep in touch and tune in. Next month, we'll be releasing our data sharing paper, followed by another paper on fare integration, and more to come as the real results and data comes pouring out of this pilot, and we figure out more about how this is performing and how agencies can be leveraging this technology. So thanks everybody for joining.